I was standing in my driveway at 5 in the morning, checking the carburetor on my snowmobile when a woman in a designer parka marched across the street with a clipboard like it was a weapon. The thermometer read -12 Fahrenheit, and I had exactly 40 minutes before I needed to be at the base of Mount Superior in Little Cottonwood Canyon, Utah. My name is Frank Jensen, and I'm the only certified avalanche forecaster for this entire region of the Wasatch Range. That snowmobile wasn't just a toy. It was the difference between life and death for every skier, snowboarder, and backcountry enthusiast who would venture into these mountains today. "Excuse me," the woman said, her breath forming angry clouds in the frozen air. "I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Pinecrest Ridge Homeowners Association, and I need to speak with you about your flagrant violation of our community noise ordinances." I glanced up from the engine, wiping grease off my hands with a rag. "Can this wait? I've got to get up the mountain before sunrise." "No, it cannot wait." Patricia clutched her clipboard tighter. "For the past 3 months, you have been starting that machine at ungodly hours, disturbing the peace and quiet that our residents paid premium prices to enjoy. Section 14.7 of our HOA covenant clearly states that no motorized recreational vehicles may be operated before 7 a.m. on weekdays or 8 a.m. on weekends." "That's not a recreational vehicle," I said, pointing at the snowmobile. "That's essential equipment for my job. I work for the Utah Avalanche Center, and I need to be on the mountain before dawn to assess conditions and issue forecasts before people start heading into the backcountry." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "I don't care if you're the President of the United States. Rules are rules, and you've violated them repeatedly. Consider this your official warning. If I hear that machine before 7 a.m. again, there will be consequences." I wanted to explain that avalanche conditions change by the hour, that temperature fluctuations overnight can turn a stable snowpack into a death trap, that my early morning assessments had literally saved lives. But Patricia had already turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her pristine house with its perfect landscaping and triple garage. I fired up the snowmobile. The engine roared to life, echoing through the quiet subdivision. I saw Patricia's living room curtains twitch as I backed out of my driveway and headed toward the canyon. That morning, I found significant wind loading on northeast aspects above 10,000 feet. The storm from 2 days earlier had deposited nearly 2 feet of low-density snow on top of a concerning layer of surface hoar. I spent 4 hours digging snow pits, conducting compression tests, and documenting my findings. By 9 a.m., I had issued a considerable avalanche danger rating for the upper elevations and sent out alerts through every available channel. By noon, Alta Ski Area reported that they had triggered 2 sizable avalanches during their morning control work. Nobody was hurt. That was the whole point of my job. I got home around 3 in the afternoon, exhausted and frozen. There was a certified letter taped to my front door. Inside was a formal notice of violation from the Pinecrest Ridge HOA, along with a fine of $500 for violating noise ordinances. The letter, signed by Patricia Whitmore in elaborate cursive, informed me that further violations would result in additional fines and potential legal action. I called my supervisor, Deanna Morrison, at the Utah Avalanche Center office in Salt Lake City. "They're fining you for doing your job." Deanna's voice carried a mix of disbelief and anger. "That's insane. You know how critical those early morning assessments are, especially during active weather patterns." "Yeah, well, apparently the HOA thinks quiet mornings are more important than avalanche safety." "Let me make some calls," Deanna said. We might be able to get some kind of exemption based on public safety. This is essential government work, even if we're technically a non-profit. I appreciate it, but you know how HOAs are. Once they decide you're the enemy, they don't back down. I was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated rapidly. I continued leaving early every morning because I had no choice. The mountains didn't care about HOA rules. Patricia responded by documenting every single departure, complete with timestamps and decibel readings she measured from her front porch. The fines kept coming, $500 each. Then came the morning of February 8th. I woke up at 4 a.m. to my phone buzzing with emergency alerts. A massive storm system was moving in, and the National Weather Service had issued winter storm warnings for the entire Wasatch Range. This was exactly the kind of setup that created deadly avalanche conditions. The new snow would be falling on weak layers we'd been monitoring for weeks. I was outside by 4:30, loading my gear onto the snowmobile. The wind was already picking up, and the first flakes were starting to fall. I needed to get up to my observation sites before the worst of the storm hit. That's when I saw the headlights. Patricia's white Escalade pulled into my driveway, blocking me in. She got out, followed by 2 men I recognized from neighborhood functions. One was Derek something, who apparently worked as a lawyer. The other was Kevin Pratt, who owned a construction company. "Step away from the vehicle," Patricia said. She wasn't alone this time, and she looked way too confident. "You're blocking me in," I said. "I need to get to work. This storm is going to create extremely dangerous avalanche conditions." "You were warned multiple times," Patricia said. "You've accumulated over $6,000 in unpaid fines. According to Section 22 of our HOA covenant, we have the right to seize property in lieu of unpaid fees and fines. You can't be serious." Derek stepped forward, holding up some official-looking documents. "I'm afraid we are. These seizure papers are completely legal. You've been given ample opportunity to comply with community standards. Your continued defiance has left us no choice." Kevin walked past me toward the snowmobile. "I'll get the trailer." "That machine is essential emergency equipment," I said, my voice rising. "Do you understand what's about to happen in those mountains? We're looking at a high to extreme avalanche danger situation. People could die if I don't get up there and assess conditions." "That's rather dramatic," Patricia said. "I'm sure someone else can handle it. You're not the only person in Utah who knows about snow." "Actually, for this region, I am. There are only 6 full-time avalanche forecasters in the entire state, and I'm the only one assigned to Little Cottonwood and the surrounding canyons." Kevin backed a trailer up to my snowmobile. He and Derek started loading it while Patricia stood with her arms crossed, making sure I didn't interfere. "You can retrieve your recreational vehicle once you've paid your fines in full, plus storage fees," Patricia said. "Now, I suggest you move your truck so we can leave. Some of us have real jobs to get to." I was shaking with anger and disbelief. "You're making a serious mistake." "The only mistake was buying a house next to someone who has no respect for his neighbors," Patricia replied. "They took my snowmobile." I stood in my driveway, watching the taillights disappear down the street as snow began falling harder. I immediately called Deanna. "They did what?" She sounded wide awake despite the early hour. "Seized my snowmobile. Said it was for unpaid HOA fines. Can they even do that, apparently?" The guy said he was a lawyer and had paperwork. Diana was quiet for a moment. "Okay, we need to figure this out fast. We've got that major storm moving in. Can you use a different vehicle to access your sites?" "Not most of them. The snowmobile is the only way to reach the remote observation stations, especially in these conditions." I can drive to some of the lower elevation sites, but I won't be able to get the full picture of what's happening up high. Do what you can. I'll call everyone I can think of. This is absolutely unacceptable. I spent that morning doing the best job I could with limited access. I drove as far as possible up Little Cottonwood Canyon before the road got too sketchy, hiked in to a few observation points, and tried to piece together the puzzle with incomplete data. The snow was falling at 2 inches per hour, and the wind was creating massive drifts. Everything I saw screamed danger, but I couldn't reach the critical zones where the most severe problems would be developing. By midday, I had issued a considerable avalanche danger rating, but I added notes explaining that my assessment was based on limited observations due to equipment issues. It felt like trying to predict a hurricane while only being able to see half the sky. That afternoon, Deanna called back. I talked to our legal team and the State Emergency Management Office. The general consensus is that yes, HOAs in Utah can technically seize property for unpaid fines if it's in their covenants. But there might be an angle we can work with regarding interference with essential government services. How long will that take? Could be weeks to get in front of a judge, maybe longer. We don't have weeks. That storm system is going to be pumping snow into these mountains for the next 3 days minimum. I know, I'm working on it. The situation got worse before it got better. Day 2 of the storm, I received frantic calls from the ski patrol directors at Alta and Snowbird. They were doing their best with their own avalanche mitigation programs, but they relied on my regional forecasts to make decisions about opening terrain. Without complete data from the backcountry zones, everyone was flying partially blind. "Frank, we need to know what's happening on the north faces above Grizzly Gulch," the Alta Patrol director said. "We've got expert terrain that accesses those zones, and we can't open it without a solid assessment." "I can't reach Grizzly Gulch without my snowmobile," I told him. "The HOA seized it." There was a long pause. "Did you just say the HOA seized your snowmobile?" "That's exactly what I said." "That's the most insane thing I've ever heard. That machine is essential safety equipment. Tell that to Patricia Whitmore." I posted about my situation on social media that evening, not expecting much. I just needed to vent my frustration. But the post went viral overnight. Turns out, lots of people have strong feelings about both HOAs and avalanche safety. By the next morning, my phone was blowing up with messages from local news stations wanting interviews. I agreed to talk to a reporter from KSL News Radio, Utah's biggest news station. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she arrived at my house within 2 hours. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Rachel said, her recorder running. "You're a professional avalanche forecaster, responsible for public safety across multiple mountain ranges, and your HOA seized your work equipment because you were leaving too early in the morning." "That's accurate." "And during a major storm cycle when avalanche danger is extremely high." "Correct." "Have there been any avalanches in the area since the storm started?" "Multiple. The ski resorts have triggered dozens during their control work. So far, no one's been hurt, but we've had 2 close calls with backcountry skiers. Both incidents happened in areas I would normally assess but couldn't reach without my snowmobile." The story aired that afternoon and exploded. Within hours, it was picked up by national news outlets. My phone didn't stop ringing. Local politicians started calling, outraged. The outdoor recreation community, which is massive in Utah, mobilized immediately. By evening, there were people protesting outside Patricia Whitmore's house with signs reading "Public Safety over HOA Tyranny" and "Let Frank Forecast." Patricia's response was to double down. She released a statement through the HOA's Facebook page, claiming I was a troublemaker who refused to follow rules that everyone else managed to follow just fine. She said I was weaponizing my job to get special treatment, and that my supposed emergency was exaggerated. That statement was a mistake. The outdoor community in Utah doesn't take kindly to people dismissing avalanche danger as exaggerated. Within an hour, her Facebook page was flooded with thousands of angry comments from skiers, snowboarders, climbers, and backcountry enthusiasts. Many of them shared stories about how avalanche forecasts had saved their lives. Some posted photos of massive avalanche debris, showing exactly what happens when conditions aren't properly assessed. But Patricia still had my snowmobile, and the storm was still raging. Day 3 brought another 2 feet of snow, and I was still limited to easily accessible areas. I did my best, but I knew there were dangerous conditions developing in zones I couldn't reach. That's when tragedy almost struck. A group of experienced backcountry skiers were touring in the Mill Creek Canyon area, a zone I would normally assess twice weekly. They triggered a large avalanche that buried 2 of them. Fortunately, their partners were able to dig them out quickly, and both survived with minor injuries. But it was close. Way too close. I was in my truck, struggling through snow on a Forest Service road when I got the call from Search and Rescue. "Frank, we need your expertise out here. We've got an avalanche burial situation in Mill Creek. 2 victims extracted, but we need to know if the slope is stable enough for us to continue operations safely." "I'm 40 minutes away." "How are the victims?" "Conscious and breathing, but shaken up. Looks like they'll be okay." "Thank God." "I'll get there as soon as I can." By the time I arrived, the victims were already being transported down to waiting ambulances. I spent an hour assessing the slope, identifying the weak layer that had failed, and determining whether it was safe for the rescue team to retrieve the abandoned gear. The whole time, I was thinking about how this might have been prevented if I'd been able to access this area 2 days earlier. The news media showed up while I was still on site. Rachel Kim was there again, along with camera crews from multiple local stations. "Frank, how do you think this avalanche could have been prevented?" Rachel asked. I chose my words carefully. "I can't say for certain whether a forecast would have prevented this specific incident. These skiers were experienced and presumably checked the avalanche forecast before they left. But what I can say is that my forecasts are based on direct observations from the field. When I can't access critical zones because my equipment has been seized, I'm forced to issue forecasts based on incomplete data. That puts everyone at greater risk." "Do you believe the HOA bears any responsibility for what happened today?" "I believe that when an HOA interferes with essential safety equipment during a major storm cycle, they're not just breaking rules, they're endangering lives." That interview aired on the evening news and went national immediately. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local story about an HOA dispute. It was a national story about institutional priorities, about bureaucracy versus public safety, about people in positions of minor authority wielding power without understanding the consequences. The next morning, I got a call from the Utah Attorney General's office. An assistant AG named Thomas Reeves wanted to meet with me. "Mr. Jensen, I've been following your situation closely," Thomas said when we met at a coffee shop in Salt Lake City. "The AG's office believes there may be grounds for the state to intervene. What the HOA has done might constitute interference with essential government services." "I'm not technically a government employee," I said. "The Utah Avalanche Center is a non-profit. But you provide essential public safety information that the state relies on for emergency management decisions. That gives us some leverage. We're prepared to file an injunction demanding the immediate return of your equipment. How long will that take? We can have it filed today and in front of a judge tomorrow morning. This is being treated as an emergency matter. Finally, some good news. But the story was far from over. That afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a man's voice said, "Is this Frank Jensen, the Avalanche forecaster?" "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Marcus Webb. I was one of the skiers buried in that avalanche yesterday in Mill Creek Canyon." My stomach tightened. "How are you doing? Are you okay?" "Physically, I'm fine. Sore ribs, some bruising, but I'll recover. Mentally, though, that's a different story. I've been skiing backcountry for 20 years and I've never been caught in a slide before. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm glad you made it out. The thing is, we did check the avalanche forecast before we went out. But your forecast that day had a note saying observations were limited due to equipment issues. We didn't realize what that meant. We thought the conditions were better than they actually were. I'm sorry. If I had been able to access that area, I might have rated it higher. That's why I'm calling. I want to help. I'm an attorney and I'm furious about what that HOA did to you. I want to offer my services pro bono. We're going to sue Patricia Whitmore and the Pinecrest Ridge HOA for reckless endangerment. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I want to go down that road. With respect, this isn't just about you anymore. What happened to me and my partner could have been fatal. The HOA's actions created a direct threat to public safety. They need to be held accountable or they'll just do something like this again. He had a point. Let me think about it. Take your time, but Frank, they could have killed us. They took essential safety equipment during a major storm because they were annoyed about noise. That's not just petty bureaucracy. That's dangerous negligence. The next morning, I was in court. The state of Utah had filed an emergency injunction, and a judge was hearing arguments. Patricia Whitmore was there with Derek, the HOA lawyer. They looked confident, like they still thought this was just a property dispute they could win with the right legal paperwork. The state's attorney laid out the case clearly. My work was essential to public safety. The timing of the seizure, during a major storm cycle, had created immediate danger. The avalanche incident in Mill Creek Canyon demonstrated the real-world consequences of limiting my ability to do my job. Derek argued that the HOA had followed proper procedures, that the seizure was legal under their covenants, and that I had repeatedly violated community standards despite multiple warnings. He claimed that my job didn't entitle me to special treatment, and that I should have simply paid the fines or adjusted my schedule to comply with noise ordinances. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Sandra Martinez, listened to both sides without much expression. Then she asked Derek a question. "Counselor, help me understand something. You're arguing that your client followed proper procedures in seizing equipment that is used for avalanche forecasting during a major winter storm. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Mr. Jensen had accumulated significant unpaid fines and had been warned repeatedly. And you don't see any public safety concerns with that action. Mr. Jensen's employer could have provided alternative equipment or found another solution. His failure to pay legitimate fines shouldn't be the HOA's problem. Judge Martinez turned to me. "Mr. Jensen, how many certified avalanche forecasters are assigned to the Little Cottonwood Canyon region?" "Just me, Your Honor. There are only 6 full-time forecasters for the entire state." "And is there alternative equipment that would allow you to access your remote observation sites?" "Not really. The snowmobile is specifically designed for winter backcountry access. In current conditions, it's the only way to safely reach many critical locations." How long have you been doing this job? 8 years in this region, 12 years total. And in your professional opinion, what were the risks of not being able to fully assess avalanche conditions during this storm cycle? Extreme risk, Your Honor. We received over 4 feet of new snow in 72 hours, falling on weak layers we'd been monitoring. Those are exactly the conditions that kill people. Without complete field observations, I was forced to issue forecasts based on partial data. That puts backcountry users at significantly higher risk. Judge Martinez looked at Patricia. Miss Whitmore, did you consider any of these safety factors before seizing Mr. Jensen's equipment? Patricia stood up, her face flushed. Your Honor, we have rules in our community that everyone is expected to follow. Mr. Jensen thinks he's special because of his job, but that doesn't give him the right to disturb the peace at all hours. We have retirees, people who work from home, families with small children. They deserve to sleep without being woken up by loud engines at 4 in the morning. So the answer is no, you didn't consider the public safety implications. I considered the safety and well-being of my community members. Your community members who presumably ski and recreate in these mountains. Patricia didn't have a good answer for that. Judge Martinez delivered her ruling immediately. I'm granting the state's injunction. The Pinecrest Ridge HOA is ordered to immediately return Mr. Jensen's snowmobile and all associated equipment. Furthermore, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from seizing this equipment again, or taking any punitive action related to its use in Mr. Jensen's professional capacity. The court recognizes that avalanche forecasting is essential public safety work that may require non-standard schedules. We'll have a full hearing in 30 days to determine a permanent resolution, but for now, Mr. Jensen needs his equipment back immediately. Your Honor, Derek stood up. The HOA would like to request time to properly process this order and arrange for return of the property. No, immediately means today. If that snowmobile is not returned to Mr. Jensen within 6 hours, Miss Whitmore will be held in contempt. You understand? Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Yes, Your Honor. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I could breathe for the first time in days. Within 4 hours, Patricia and Kevin showed up at my house with my snowmobile on the same trailer they'd used to take it. They unloaded it in silence, refusing to make eye contact with me. Patricia thrust a piece of paper at me, some kind of receipt, then left without a word. I immediately called Diana to let her know I was back in business, then spent the rest of the afternoon doing maintenance checks to make sure the snowmobile was still in good working order. Everything seemed fine. They'd stored it in Kevin's warehouse, so at least it had been kept out of the weather. The next morning I was back to my normal routine. Up at 4:30, gear loaded, heading into the mountains before sunrise. The storm had finally broken, and we had clear, cold conditions that were perfect for assessment work. I spent the day visiting every site I'd missed over the past week, documenting conditions, and building a complete picture of the avalanche situation. What I found was concerning but manageable. The new snow had bonded reasonably well in most areas, but there were still pockets of instability on steep, wind-loaded slopes. I issued a moderate avalanche danger rating with warnings about specific terrain features to avoid. It felt good to be doing my job properly again. But the legal situation wasn't over. Marcus Webb, the attorney who'd been buried in the avalanche, reached out again. Frank, I've been doing some research into the Pinecrest Ridge HOA. Did you know that Patricia Whitmore has a history of aggressive enforcement actions? You're the third person she's targeted with property seizures in the last 2 years. I didn't know that. Yeah, There was a guy who ran a home business, and she seized his company van for supposedly violating parking regulations. And before that, she went after someone for unauthorized landscaping modifications and seized their riding lawn mower. Both cases eventually settled out of court, but she's got a pattern of using property seizures as intimidation tactics. That's messed up, but I got my snowmobile back. I'm not sure what else there is to do. There's the matter of the Avalanche incident. My partner and I could have died because we didn't have accurate avalanche information. That was a direct result of the HOA's actions. Can you really prove that connection? I think we can. And I think we should try. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. What if next time someone actually dies? He had a point that I couldn't ignore. We agreed to move forward with a lawsuit, naming both Patricia Whitmore personally and the Pinecrest Ridge HOA. The charges included reckless endangerment, interference with emergency services, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit made news immediately, which added fuel to a fire that was already burning hot. The HOA's insurance company got involved, and things got complicated fast. Meanwhile, the court date for the permanent hearing was approaching. In the weeks leading up to that hearing, I learned a lot about HOA law in Utah. Turns out, HOAs have broad powers, but those powers aren't unlimited. Courts can override HOA covenants when they conflict with public policy or create unreasonable restrictions. The question was whether my situation met that threshold. The permanent hearing was more detailed than the emergency injunction. Both sides brought expert witnesses. The state brought in Diana to testify about the importance of my work and the irreplaceable nature of my position. They also brought in the ski patrol directors from Alta and Snowbird, who explained how they relied on my forecasts for critical safety decisions. The HOA brought in acoustic engineers who testified about noise levels and sleep disruption studies. They also brought neighbors who complained about being woken up by my early morning departures. One woman, a retiree named Susan, got tearful on the stand talking about how the noise had affected her quality of life. I actually felt bad about that. I didn't want to disturb people's sleep. But I also didn't have a choice about my schedule. The turning point came when Marcus Webb testified. He described the avalanche, the terror of being buried, the desperate struggle to breathe under the snow. He talked about the note on my forecast about limited observations and how that had factored into their decision-making. "We thought we were being responsible," Marcus said. "We checked the forecast. We had the right equipment. We knew the terrain. But we didn't realize that the forecast was incomplete. We didn't understand what limited observations due to equipment issues really meant. If we had known that critical areas hadn't been assessed because the forecaster's snowmobile had been seized by an HOA, we never would have gone out that day." Derek, the HOA lawyer, tried to argue that Marcus and his partner had assumed the risks inherent in backcountry skiing. But Judge Martinez shut that down. "Counselor, people assume risks based on available information. If that information is incomplete because an HOA seized essential safety equipment, that changes the calculation significantly." The judge took 2 days to deliver her ruling. When it came, it was comprehensive and decisive. She ruled that my use of the snowmobile for professional purposes was protected from HOA restrictions. She found that avalanche forecasting constituted essential public safety work, and that HOA covenants could not be enforced in ways that interfered with that work. She also ordered the HOA to reimburse me for all fines they'd levied and to pay my legal costs. But she didn't stop there. Judge Martinez also ordered the Pinecrest Ridge HOA to revise their noise ordinances, to include specific exemptions for essential services, including emergency responders, medical professionals with on-call responsibilities, and public safety workers with non-standard schedules. And she ordered Patricia Whitmore to attend mediation training at the HOA's expense. The lawsuit from Marcus Webb was still pending, and the publicity surrounding the case was causing serious problems for the HOA. Several homeowners had started questioning Patricia's leadership, and there was talk of a recall election. The HOA's insurance company, facing potential liability for the Avalanche incident, was pushing hard for a settlement. 3 months after the snowmobile seizure, I was working in my garage on a Saturday afternoon when Patricia Whitmore walked up my driveway. I tensed, expecting another confrontation. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. Her voice was different, quieter. "Sure." She looked around my garage, at the Avalanche safety equipment hanging on the walls, the stacks of weather instruments, the detailed topographic maps. "I didn't really understand what you did," she said finally. "I mean, I knew you worked with avalanches, but I didn't understand what that actually meant. I didn't say anything, just waited. I went up to Alta last week," she continued. "Took a ski lesson." The instructor pointed out some of the avalanche paths, talked about the control work they do every morning. He mentioned your name, said your forecasts were essential for keeping people safe. I started asking questions, and he explained how it all works. The early morning assessments, the snow pit tests, all of it. Okay. I was wrong. I was so focused on the rules and what I thought was fair that I didn't stop to think about why you were doing what you were doing. I put people at risk because I was angry about being woken up early. That's not okay. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. I didn't see any. She just looked tired and maybe a little ashamed. "I've resigned as HOA president," Patricia said. "The board accepted my resignation yesterday, and I wanted to personally apologize to you. What I did was wrong, and I'm sorry." "I appreciate that." The HOA's insurance company wants to settle the lawsuit. They're offering Marcus Webb and his partner $200,000, plus coverage of all medical expenses and legal costs. Our attorney says we should take it. "That's between you and them. I know. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. What you do matters. It matters more than my sleep schedule or my idea of what a quiet neighborhood should look like." After Patricia left, I sat in my garage for a long time, thinking about how things had spiraled so out of control. A noise complaint had turned into a legal battle that made national news and nearly cost people their lives. All because someone in a position of minor authority decided that rules mattered more than context. The lawsuit settled 2 weeks later. Marcus Webb called to tell me the news. "We got what we asked for," he said. Plus a formal apology from the HOA and a commitment to donate $50,000 to avalanche safety education programs in Utah. That's good. It is. And Frank, thank you. Not just for the avalanche forecasting, but for fighting this. I really think this case is going to change how HOAs operate in Utah. There's already talk at the state legislature about new laws to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. He was right about that. By the end of the year, Utah had passed new legislation specifically addressing HOA restrictions on essential service workers. The law, informally called the Avalanche Forecaster Protection Act by local news, made it clear that HOAs couldn't enforce covenants in ways that interfered with public safety work, emergency services, or essential government functions. Life gradually returned to normal. I kept doing my job, leaving early every morning, assessing conditions, issuing forecasts. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Bob, approached me one day to ask if there was anything they could do to help minimize the noise impact on neighbors. We had an actual conversation about it, and I explained that I was already using the quietest snowmobile I could find that still had the power and reliability I needed for backcountry work. Bob suggested that the HOA could offer to help soundproof garages for the houses closest to mine, using HOA funds. It was a reasonable solution that acknowledged both my needs and the neighbors' concerns. Several people took them up on the offer. The outdoor community in Utah didn't forget what had happened. That spring, the Utah Avalanche Center held their annual fundraiser and invited me as a special guest. The event raised 3 times what they usually brought in, with much of the money earmarked for equipment upgrades and expanded forecasting coverage. During the event, Diana pulled me aside. "You know, this whole situation ended up being weirdly good for avalanche awareness. We've had more people taking our safety courses this year than ever before. The media coverage made people realize how much work goes into keeping them safe in the mountains. I guess that's a silver lining. More than that, the state legislature increased our funding based partly on the publicity from your case. We're going to be able to hire 2 more forecasters and upgrade our weather stations. Lives are going to be saved because of that." I thought about that a lot over the following months. Something that had felt like a nightmare at the time had somehow turned into a catalyst for positive change. HOA laws got reformed. Avalanche safety got more funding and attention. People who had never thought much about avalanche forecasting now understood why it mattered. The next winter, I had one of those perfect mornings that reminded me why I loved my job. Fresh powder day, crystal clear skies, and stable snowpack conditions that made for incredible backcountry skiing. My early morning assessment showed low avalanche danger across the region, and I knew thousands of people were going to have amazing days in the mountains because they could do so safely. I was packing up my gear at one of my observation sites when I saw a group of skiers approaching. One of them, a young woman maybe in her 20s, recognized me. "Hey, are you Frank Jensen?" "Yeah, that's me." "Dude, you're like a legend. My dad told me about what happened with your HOA. That was insane. It was definitely an experience." "Well, thanks for what you do. I'm out here every weekend, and I always check your forecasts before I go. It's good to know someone's actually out here looking at conditions instead of just guessing from a computer model. That's the job." She and her friends skied off, and I stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the trees. That was what it was all about. Not the legal battles or the news coverage or the policy changes, although those things mattered. It was about those skiers heading into the backcountry with good information, making smart decisions, and coming home safely at the end of the day. I fired up my snowmobile, the engine sound echoing across the basin, and headed back down toward civilization. It was barely 7 in the morning, but I'd already completed the most important work of the day. Somewhere in Pinecrest Ridge, my neighbors were probably just waking up. Maybe some of them were annoyed by the distant sound of my engine, but most of them, I hoped, understood now why it mattered. The mountains were never going to care about HOA covenants or noise ordinances. They operated on their own schedule, following the laws of physics and weather patterns that predated human civilization. My job was to understand those patterns, to read the language of snow and ice and wind, and to translate that information into forecasts that kept people alive. It was a job that required early mornings and specialized equipment, and sometimes irritated the neighbors. But it was also a job that mattered, that made a tangible difference in people's lives. The HOA situation had taught me that not everyone would understand or appreciate that, but it had also taught me that most people, when you explained it clearly and gave them the full context, did understand. They did care about keeping their communities safe, even if that sometimes meant accepting minor inconveniences. Patricia Whitmore had learned that lesson the hard way, and I hoped other HOA board members across the country were learning it too. Rules and regulations had their place, but they couldn't be applied blindly without consideration for context and consequences. Common sense had to factor in somewhere. As I pulled into my driveway that morning, I saw Bob, the new HOA president, out walking his dog. He waved at me and I waved back. It was a small gesture, but it represented something important. We'd found a way to coexist, to balance community standards with practical reality. I parked the snowmobile in my garage, stowed my gear, and headed inside to file my morning report. The data from today would become part of the permanent record, another piece in the enormous puzzle of understanding how snow behaves in these mountains. Someone might look at this data years from now, trying to predict conditions for a similar weather pattern, and my observations would help keep them safe. That was the real story behind the headlines and the legal battles and the viral social media posts. It was about dedication to a job that saved lives, even when that dedication came with complications. It was about fighting for the right to do essential work, even when that meant standing up to people who had their own ideas about how things should be done. The lawsuit money that Marcus Webb had donated to Avalanche education programs was already making a difference. The Utah Avalanche Center had expanded their free public awareness courses, teaching people how to read avalanche bulletins, assess terrain, and make smart decisions in the backcountry. Every person who took those courses was someone who might avoid making a fatal mistake. And maybe, somewhere in all of this, Patricia Whitmore had learned something valuable too. Power, even the minor power of an HOA presidency, came with responsibility. Rules existed to serve communities, not the other way around. And sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was recognize when they'd made a mistake and do what they could to make it right. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the Wasatch Range in brilliant white glory. Somewhere up there, people were enjoying those mountains, pushing their limits, experiencing the incredible freedom of backcountry skiing. Most of them would never know my name or think about the work that went into keeping them safe. That was fine. That was how it should be. I had a quiet day ahead of me, catching up on paperwork and equipment maintenance. But tomorrow I'd be up at 4:30 again, loading my snowmobile in the pre-dawn darkness, heading back into those mountains to do the work that mattered. The work that someone had to do, no matter how many HOA covenants said otherwise. And if my neighbors heard the engine start, maybe now they'd roll over, check the clock, and think, there goes Frank, heading out to make sure we're all safe today. Maybe some of them would go back to sleep annoyed. But hopefully most of them would understand that some noises, some disruptions to the peaceful quiet of a suburban morning, were worth accepting because of what they represented. Essential work doesn't follow a 9-to-5 schedule. Safety doesn't wait for convenient hours. And the mountains, magnificent and dangerous in equal measure, certainly didn't care what time the HOA said I was allowed to start my engine. I was the only avalanche forecaster for this region, and that meant being ready to go whenever the conditions demanded it. That was the job I'd signed up for, the responsibility I'd accepted. A snowmobile seizure and a legal battle hadn't changed that commitment. If anything, they'd reinforced it, reminding me why this work mattered and why it was worth fighting for. The story could have ended badly. People could have died. The avalanche that caught Marcus Webb and his partner could have had a different outcome. That thought still kept me up some nights, thinking about how close we'd come to tragedy because of what seemed like such a petty dispute, but we'd gotten lucky. Everyone had survived, lessons had been learned, and systems had changed for the better. The scars from that battle, both personal and institutional, would fade with time. What would remain was a better understanding of how to balance competing interests, how to write rules that served their intended purpose without creating dangerous unintended consequences. As I sat at my computer, finishing up my morning report, I felt grateful. Grateful for the job that let me spend my days in the mountains I loved. Grateful for the legal system that had ultimately protected my ability to do that job. Grateful for the outdoor community that had rallied behind me when things got difficult. And even, in a strange way, grateful for Patricia Whitmore, whose overreach had inadvertently created an opportunity for important changes. The whole experience had taught me that standing up for what's right sometimes meant standing alone at first. It meant enduring criticism and legal threats in public battles, but it also meant that when you were fighting for something that truly mattered, eventually other people would recognize that and stand with you. My phone buzzed with a text from Deanna. Great forecast this morning. Conditions look perfect. Enjoy your day off the mountain. I smiled and sent back a thumbs up. Then I made myself some breakfast and settled in for a rare, quiet day at home. Tomorrow I'd be back at it. But for now, I could rest knowing that I'd done my job, that people were safe, and that the systems designed to keep them that way were stronger than they'd been before. The snowmobile sat in my garage, ready for the next early morning departure. The HOA couldn't touch it now. The law was clear, the precedent was set, and everyone understood what was at stake. It was just another tool in my arsenal, essential equipment for essential work. And if that engine woke up some neighbors tomorrow morning before dawn, well, that was the sound of someone heading out to save lives. That was the sound of dedication and responsibility and public service. That was the sound that had caused so much trouble and ultimately changed so much for the better. That was the sound of an avalanche forecaster, doing the job that needed to be done, when it needed to be done, regardless of what any HOA covenant had to say about it.